Hello, this is a sermon for Sunday the 2nd of July 2023. That will be the 13th in Ordinary Time, Year A. The readings are Genesis 22 verses 1 to 14, that is the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, and Matthew chapter 10 verses 40 to 42, some closing words from Jesus to the disciples before they embark upon their missionary journey. The one thing Abraham can give that is dearer to him than his own life is his son, Isaac. For Isaac represents everything that Abraham holds dear. Isaac was the reward for Abraham's past faithfulness in leaving Haran to go to a land he did not know. Isaac represented the future hope that Abraham would one day become the father of a great nation and a blessing to all families of the earth. This is the vision that called Abraham to follow God's bidding and go to the promised land. Isaac makes sense of Abraham's life. Without him, Abraham's life would be in ruins. There is no greater sacrifice that Abraham could make. We know that the Judeo-Christian tradition did not feature child sacrifice, but Abraham had no such foreknowledge. He was called by a God whose name he did not know, to go to a land he could not name, to become a father of a child he and Sarah were too old to have. Child sacrifice would not be so remarkable in that distant age. Abraham had to learn what this unseen God expected of him. What Abraham discovered was that this God demanded faith, absolute trust, and unswerving obedience. Given that faith and trust, this God without a name will deliver in ways you cannot foresee, and to a degree of which you can only dream. The Lord will provide, says Abraham, full of tragic irony, as his young boy asks where the creature is for the sacrifice. Abraham believes Isaac is the one God is providing at this stage. This is the ultimate test of Abraham's faith. There is an added layer of symbolism for the later Christian reader of this story, as we note how Isaac approaches the hill of sacrifice in the company of a donkey and with wood for his own execution. Christians see a foreshadowing of Christ's entry to Jerusalem, riding on a donkey, and later carrying his cross of wood for his own sacrifice. In the event, the dramatic story takes an unexpected twist for Abraham when God does indeed provide a ram, caught by its horns in the undergrowth. For Abraham, this is where the story ends, so to speak. But Christians know that God could allow Abraham to spare Isaac because of the sacrifice that was to be offered in the future, in Jesus. This is worth taking to heart. Abraham saw only part of the picture. Often our mortal spans are too short to see the great sweep of God's providential plans. Even when we think we have understood, often we have only a partial grasp of what God is doing. We should take some comfort in this when we feel angry with God, that God is not getting on with things, and we become impatient with waiting, or when God calls us to perform duties whose value we cannot understand. So, what was God doing in putting Abraham through this traumatic event? What test did Abraham have to pass? Well, I believe the great test was to teach Abraham to trust God to provide. Just as simple and yet as profound as that. The foundation of the Abrahamic faith fulfilled supremely in Jesus Christ, is that God will provide. God will provide salvation. And salvation does not depend on what Abraham or any other person can do, but upon what God will do. Our role as faithful followers is to learn to trust God, to believe God really will provide for us and through us. And we then become witnesses to the world of God's dependability. The alternative to believing God will provide is to think that either you have to provide for yourself or that someone else should provide for you. The higher the price you think you have to pay, the more likely it is that you think someone else should do the paying. Abraham was taught that he does not have to make Isaac pay the cost of his belief in this new, unnamed God. This new God will do the providing. This is so different to so many early religious traditions across the whole globe. From cannibalism in the Pacific to burning wicker men in the Scottish Highlands to cutting the throats of hapless victims in Central America. People have found gruesome ways to make others pay the price. So many religions of the past assumed that the gods needed placating. Their greed, vanity, and bloodlust needed to be satisfied and could only be satisfied by the spilling of human blood. Genesis 22 makes a formal and decisive break with that basic human instinct. No longer do the powerful have to seek out the less powerful to pay the price they suppose their bloodthirsty gods are demanding. The passage from Matthew 10, verses 40 to 42, adds further insight into what it means that God will provide. Who welcomes you welcomes me and the one who sent me, Jesus assures his disciples as they embark upon their missionary travels. This concept works so much more easily in societies such as first century Palestine, which had a far more collective view of personality than the modern Western individualism that so dominates currently. It was taken for granted in Jesus' society, as it still is in so many non-Western societies to this day, that no individual acts in isolation, but each individual represents his or her family, tribe, and ancestors. It would have been self-evident that to welcome the disciples of Jesus amounts to welcoming Jesus himself, and in welcoming Jesus to any degree also entails welcoming God who has sent him. There is, however, a spiritual reality to this beyond the simply cultural understanding of personality. That spiritual reality being hinted at here is the promise that each Christian missionary does not go alone, but that Christ travels with those whom he sends. Now, what does this mean, that Jesus goes with us? For Jesus has already told his disciples that they will not be immune from rejection and violence just because they go in his name. But he does promise that in their hour of need, he will give them the words they need to witness to a hostile world. Jesus does not promise them safety from death, but he does promise that they will have nothing to fear, because the world can only kill the body, not the soul. And Jesus assures his disciples that God has counted every hair upon their head. So greatly and dearly does God love us and care for us. They are safely in God's hands, whatever their fate at the hands of the world. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it, says Jesus. Verse 39 of that chapter. There were many who would make the Christians pay for their belief in Jesus. St. Stephen's martyrdom in Jerusalem is just the first of many thousands who have been crucified, burnt alive, beheaded, torn apart by wild beasts in the arena, imprisoned and tortured. Christ being our companion along the way does not mean that Christ will protect us from such evil. He just promises to strengthen us and offer us ultimate victory. Being a witness for Christ involves trusting not in our own strength, but in the willingness and ability of Christ to work through us, even in our suffering. The truly significant aspect of this passage is that Jesus will reward those who serve faithfully and those who respond with charity. Yet there is also a warning implied for those who treat his followers in despicable ways. Whatever they do to the least of his followers, they are doing to him. That is intended as a warning to all those who would attack and oppress his followers. It is a warning intended to stay their hand before they strike. Unfortunately, there are too many in this world who still believe in human sacrifice. Not in the old sense of killing innocent people to placate angry gods, but in other more sophisticated and indirect ways. For example, we still see senior army commanders pushing more men into a meat grinder, feeding a military disaster when the battle is already lost, sacrificing men's lives for the sake of holding on to their military rank. We still see political dictators sacrificing the lives and well-being of their powerless citizens by imprisonment of political dissenters, coercive re-education, or the simple starvation of the masses through sheer political incompetence and corruption. We still see the financial elite of many a wealthy country willing to let the less affluent pay the price of their banking disasters and stock market bubbles through engineering recessions to bring down inflation, which sacrifice the jobs of others whilst they hold on to theirs. We'll still see the criminal godfathers willing to sacrifice the gullible and vulnerable who act as drug mules or as perpetrators of street violence to enforce their criminal power. We still see too many companies willing to exploit the desperate in sweatshops, lithium mines, coffee plantations and the like, just for ever greater profits. Abraham may have taught the world a valuable lesson. Sacrificing others for your benefit, no matter how you try to justify that by religion, politics, or other worldly stratagems, is not what God requires. Sacrificing others for your own benefit is contrary to the will of God. God will provide. It's not your job to make somebody else provide for you. It is a lesson which the world has yet to fully take to heart.